Very quickly, because I don't want to, I want to give Dr. Waters a chance if he needs to say anything, is that when I was a pastor, I had a person in my congregation who rarely took the Lord's Supper. And I would tell this person, I said, you have to understand. This person would say, I'm not worthy to come to the table. I say, you're right, you're not. None of us are. But we don't come to the table in our worthiness, but rather we come to the table because of Christ's worthiness. And I would say, so the question you have to ask yourself, is Christ worthy? And she would say, yes. And I would say, okay, then you can come to the table. My fear is to me, that's all a trust discussion. It's all about Christ, as you've emphasized here. So I would want to say, yeah, give me more of that. But if I introduce the specter of, but you've got to love him in order to come to this table rather than just trust him.
But that is what you say, right? You said that. Seriously, you said that. You must love him or you're not saved, right? Okay.
But I see that conversation going into a U-turn.
Go ahead,
Either way.
So Guy...
And I just wanted to offer a couple of thoughts on it's a distinction I think is really important in Dr. Piper's book. And he brought it up a few minutes ago. We speak of a love or a trust within faith, and then there's a love or trust outside of faith. Just a couple thoughts on that. One is that when we come to specific passages in the New Testament, some speak very clearly of love to neighbor, and that's what that love is. Others speak of love to God, and that's what that love is. Others, it's hard to tell the difference between the two. And I think one liability of this distinction is that it can push us in various passages to making distinctions that the New Testament authors are not intending to draw. But I think more to the point, there is a distinction between faith and love. The grace of faith and the grace of love are distinct, not separable at all, but they are distinct. And I think we have to be asking the question, given that distinction, what makes love love that distinguishes it from faith? There's something in love that we don't affirm of faith, and vice versa. And we don't want to be collapsing these graces into one another, which is not what Dr. Piper is intending to do. But I think that's the direction.
What would be the thing in love that's not present in faith? How would you describe that? What would be there's something in love that's not in faith. What is the something in love that's not in faith?
And I want to be clear that I'm saying that love is accompanying faith. It's the fruit of faith. It rests on faith. But that affection, which leads to a parting of all things, as Moses did, the treasures of Egypt for Christ, and a willing to do all and give all for the sake of Jesus Christ, that's getting us into the territory of love. And to be sure, faith is antecedent to that. But I wouldn't put that into faith as inseparable as those two things are, because I think those two things are distinct conceptually, and certainly the way that the New Testament writers speak.
How would maybe that we're almost out of time here, but so maybe one little last point here on one of the places that John leaned heavily is using the sort of sensory bodily language of eating, drinking, and tasting as sort of the metaphors to describe faith. Do those work really well for you? And if you were going to explain, somebody said, I remember when I talked to my dad at one point, who's a professing believer, about what faith is, and I explained the difference between knowing that honey is sweet because you read about it in a book, or knowing that honey is sweet because you put some on your tongue, and that faith is it tastes good. Taste and see that the Lord is good. When I said faith is that, and I said, do you have that experience? He went, yeah, okay, I get that, yes. Would that be a pastorally helpful, or would you worry, no, you're bleeding too much over into the love affection category by using language of tasting goodness or tasting sweetness to describe what faith is?
I think metaphors are powerful. That's why God uses them, and they communicate richly. We always have to be careful when we encounter a metaphor to read it in the bounds that God assigns to it in the Scripture. And that's going to be my caution coming into these discussions, that there is a reason that John speaks of eating, drinking, tasting in light of coming to Christ. There's something we're to see about that. But like any metaphor, that can be extended well beyond the limits it was ever intended to go. And we have to be careful not to transgress those boundaries either. And Dr. Piper would agree, metaphors are bounded. I'd also say that metaphors, while they are illustrative, don't substitute for a definition. They only help if you know what the thing is. And to be sure that the point of entry into faith is through these metaphors, but the New Testament does give us a definition of faith. John gives us a definition of faith, that the metaphors are intended to illustrate for our benefit. We just want to be careful not to substitute a metaphor for a definition, which again, I'm not saying that's happening here, but that is a liability when we lean very heavily on these metaphors.
Right. We are out of time. I'm sorry that we didn't get to questions from you guys, but hopefully the interaction was fruitful. Would you guys give thanks to our panelists at the time?